For 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen, heading out to the movies on Sunday night with her husband seemed like the perfect ending to what had been, for them, an unusually nice weekend. The popular comedy they'd picked out for that night's entertainment, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, was just the answer to what John Ruetten called their Sunday night blues, that feeling that only one night's sleep stood between them and the start of their busy Monday to Friday work week. As Sherry opened the closet in their townhouse and pulled out their coats, she looked over at the 3 red roses John had given her that morning, 1 flower for each of the 3 months they had been married. Sherry had rearranged the roses in their slim glass vase and put them in the center of the dining room table where the flowers added a cheerful note of color. But seeing them now, Sherry couldn't keep from sighing. It was February 23, 1986, and Sherry and John had known one another for a total of 21 months, and Sherry had somehow expected that they would have worked out all their problems before they had exchanged wedding vows back on November 23rd. But that hadn't happened. Instead, the last 3 months had seemed to bring their differences in everything, from how they communicated to how they handled money, into sharper and sharper focus. And this evening, as the two of them got ready for the 40-minute drive to the movie theater north of their home in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, Sherry just hoped they could avoid a repeat of other times when they'd spent entire car rides arguing with each other. It was still hard for Sherry to forget one of their first getaways together as a married couple, a ski trip to Mammoth Mountain 5 hours away. From the time they had stepped out of their townhouse to the time they had arrived at the ski resort, Sherry had argued with John about money, and 2 months later, that was still a sore subject. The problem was not their income. They both had good jobs. Sherry was the director of critical care nursing at the Glendale Adventist Hospital, 25 minutes south of their home. 27-year-old John was a mechanical engineer who had just started a new job with a manufacturing company located 30 minutes north of their townhouse. Instead, the problem, as Sherry saw it, was that John had a taste for new and expensive cars, and he didn't mind at all going into debt to pay for them. There was the BMW he'd bought her in place of an engagement ring, and then there was the brand new 1986 Mazda RX-7 sports car that they'd be driving tonight to the movie theater. Sherry had always been someone who saved money. Despite growing up in comfortable circumstances in a comfortable neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona, Sherry's parents had been very strict about money. They had taught all 3 of their daughters to live within their means, and that meant doing things like not buying fancy cars you couldn't pay for with cash. On that trip to Mammoth Mountain, Sherry had told John that she was going to split up their bank accounts and set up a savings account in her own name. By the time they'd arrived at Mammoth, they'd been so upset and annoyed with each other that instead of skiing and spending a romantic overnight together, they just pulled into the resort parking lot, gone to the restrooms, piled back into the car, and driven 5 hours back home to Van Nuys. And now, all these weeks later, as Sherry and John walked down the stairway from inside of their 3-level townhouse into the garage on the floor level, there was another issue, even more troubling than finances and much harder to put into words, that had also begun to put a strain on Sherry's relationship with John. And that was Sherry's growing conviction that someone had recently begun to take a very, very keen interest in her and John. When Sherry had first told John about her feeling that they were being watched, and that Sherry sometimes felt like someone was actually following her, John had taken her concern seriously enough that back in December, they had installed a new security system inside of their townhouse. But instead of going away, Sherry's sense of uneasiness just seemed to get worse. At the same time, whenever she tried to bring the subject up to John, she felt like he was starting not to believe her. Now, as Sherry opened the front passenger seat and slipped inside the sports car, she promised herself that she was not going to let her annoyance with John spoil the 3-month anniversary that had started that morning with his gift of roses. Instead, Sherry forced herself to think about what a nice day she and John had just had. After she and John had eaten a leisurely breakfast together, they'd been joined by Sherry's younger sister and her husband Brian, who made the hour-and-a-half drive west to Van Nuys from Loma Linda. Sherry had let her brother-in-law drive her new silver BMW, while Sherry enjoyed fussing over Teresa, who was 5 months pregnant with her first child. And after Brian and Teresa had left, Sherry, who loved all outdoor sports and activities, had gone for a long run. And when she got back, she and John had yet another visitor. Mike Buldrick was one of several of her husband's old college friends, ex-girlfriends, and dorm mates that Sherry had met since she started dating John. While not all of those people had become Sherry's friends, her smile when she got back from her run and saw Mike was genuinely warm and welcome. Mike had been one of the groomsmen at Sherry and John's wedding back in November, and no matter what had happened since then in Sherry and John's life, that day in late fall had been such a happy occasion for all of them. Now, as John started the car engine and backed the Mazda out of the garage, Sherry wondered whether John ever talked to Mike or anyone else about things like money or Sherry's safety concerns. But looking now over at John's untroubled face, Sherry decided he probably didn't, because to John, they weren't really his problems. They were Sherry's problems. Turning her gaze back to the road in front of them, Sherry hardly noticed the neighborhoods and towns she and John were passing on their scenic route to Simi Valley. Glamorous places like Beverly Hills and Malibu and Pasadena, places that had made her adopted home state of California famous throughout the world. Instead, what Sherry was seeing in her mind's eye was the face of that person who was staring at her and John when they were out eating dinner recently at a local restaurant, and then melting out of sight immediately after locking eyes with Sherry. And instead of hearing the sound of traffic as the maroon Mazda sped north, Sherry heard the sound of the phone calls once and sometimes twice a week, and then a click whenever Sherry or John actually picked up the receiver to say hello. John could say what he wanted to about there being a problem with the phone line, but Sherry wasn't buying it. And the more Sherry felt like John was dismissing her concerns, the more Sherry had started to confide about her fears and the issues in her marriage, not to John, but to her friends and to her parents. And in particular, Sherry had found that her father, Nels Rasmussen, was taking every one of her conversations very seriously. Nels had always been especially protective of his middle daughter, the child who was so smart she'd been enrolled in college at the age of 16, and who turned heads everywhere she went thanks to her physical beauty, and to the fact that she was a full 6 feet tall in stocking feet. And Nels was equally proud of how his joyful and playful youngster had grown up into a kind, independent, and fun-loving young woman whose sense of adventure and ambition had taken her from Tucson, Arizona, out to the bright lights and big city of Los Angeles. Nels was also less worried about Sherry's difference with John over money than he was about Sherry's other harder-to-define fears about being watched and maybe even threatened. Nels might not know all the details of Sherry's marriage and life, but he did know his daughter was not prone to imagining things or having anxiety attacks for no reason. Nels had also sensed in his latest phone conversations with his daughter that Sherry, who had always been a person of action, had come to some kind of a decision. And, as Nels later reported to his wife, he had the distinct impression that with or without John's support or involvement, Sherry was going to take steps of her own to resolve the strains she was feeling in her marriage, and to make sure that both inside and outside of her townhouse, she felt safe and free from any prying eyes. By the time John and Sherry had pulled into the parking lot surrounding the brightly lit movie theater, the hypnotic motion of freeway driving had worked its magic, and Sherry had finally relaxed. And when John stepped around to her side of the car to open the door for her, she gave him that radiant smile that never failed to take his breath away. A few hours later, their hands still buttery from the bag of popcorn they had shared, Sherry and John were stepping out of the crowded movie theater into the darkness and making their way through the busy parking lot back to their car. The movie had lived up to its good reviews, and the story about a rich couple whose stale marriage and lives are changed by the arrival of a homeless vagrant had made both Sherry and John laugh. But as Sherry settled into the passenger seat of the Mazda for the drive home, she suddenly found herself thinking about the husband in the film, who was having an affair with the couple's live-in maid. Looking over at John, Sherry reminded herself of the very direct conversations she and John had had before getting married about always being able to trust one another. As for John, from the moment he had met Sherry almost 2 years ago at a party hosted by a mutual friend, all other women in his life had been instantly forgotten about, and the good-looking engineer with the dark hair and white teeth had fallen hook, line, and sinker for the tall, friendly, and vivacious nurse who was now his wife. Turning to smile at Sherry, John put the key into the ignition, turned on the engine, and a few minutes later, they had joined the river of cars that flowed south down the freeway into Los Angeles. By 10 p.m. that night, Sherry and John were walking up the stairway that led from their 2-car garage up to their 3-level townhouse. Stopping in the living room, they locked the door behind them and put away their jackets. Then they walked up the short flight of stairs that led into their kitchen and dining room, and the two of them chatted while John put together a lunch that he would take to work the next day. One more short flight of stairs, and they had reached their master bedroom and bath on the 3rd level. As they were both getting ready for bed, Sherry told John that she was dreading a class about conflict resolutions she was scheduled to teach at work the next day, and that she was thinking about calling out sick. Just before the two of them turned out the light and slipped off to sleep, John urged Sherry to just go in and teach the class and get it over with. But when the couple woke up just before 7 a.m. the next morning, Monday, February 12th, only John got out of bed to shower and dress. Still tucked under the blanket, Sherry told John that she'd decided she was going to stay home. Before leaving the house, John said yes, he'd be sure to give Sherry a call later that morning to check in on her, and by 7:20, he was locking the living room door behind him and walking down the stairs into the garage, where he opened the door of his Mazda and hopped inside. As John backed his car out of the garage, he paused just long enough to hit the remote button that would close the garage door behind him. 10 hours later, John was hopping back into his car to make the 30-minute drive back home to Balboa Townhomes, this time stopping just long enough to pick up some clothes from the dry cleaner. True to his word, John had called Sherry that morning from his office, twice in fact, and when Sherry didn't answer either call, John had checked in with Sherry's secretary at Glendale Adventist Hospital to see if maybe Sherry had decided to go to work that day after all. And as far as Sherry's secretary knew, without having actually seen Sherry that morning, the answer to John's question was yes, she had gone to work. What John wouldn't find out until later was that that information was wrong. By noon, when Sherry's sister, Teresa, had made her usual call to Sherry, Sherry's secretary told Teresa that Sherry had called out sick. So it wasn't until John pulled into the driveway of Unit 205 and noticed that the garage door was open and that Sherry's BMW was gone that he felt the first flicker of worry. That worry intensified when he saw broken glass scattered on the driveway. So after pulling his Mazda into the garage and turning off the engine, John only stopped long enough to grab the pile of clean clothes before he stepped out of the car and hurried through the door at the back of the garage that led up to their living room. Distracted by the thoughts of the broken glass and missing BMW, John didn't notice the dark red flecks on the staircase wall next to him. But an instant later, John's attention snapped fully back to the present. Right in front of him, at the top of the stairs from the garage, he could see that the door into the living room of Unit 205 was wide open. And right inside, lying on her back in the middle of their living room floor, John saw his wife, Sherry. And he knew instantly that something terrible had happened. His wife's beautiful face was unrecognizable. One eye stared sightlessly upward, the other eye was swollen shut and crusted with blood. The rest of Sherry's face was dark with bruises. Wearing a short red robe over her sleeveless undershirt and panties, Sherry's right arm looked frozen in place with her hand raised stiffly towards the ceiling. Her left hand lay across her chest, her wedding band shining dully on her long, slender finger. All around Sherry, there were smears of blood and signs of a terrible struggle. Electrical cords and wires snaked across the floor, most of them leading to the stereo equipment that was stacked in a messy pile right next to the door where John was now standing. Carefully laying his armload of clothes over the back of the sofa, John took a few slow steps towards Sherry's body. Then, with the toe of his shoe, he reached out and touched the stiff, cold flesh of his wife's bare leg. A moment later, John had picked up the phone that had been knocked to the floor and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatch operator at the Los Angeles police station answered the call and asked John the nature of his emergency, his voice was flat with shock. "I think my wife is dead." And then, after giving his address and ending the call, John pulled a hand towel out of a small cupboard, walked back over to Sherry's body, and draped the towel over her ruined face. As John would tell the first medics who arrived on the scene 8 minutes later, the sight of Sherry's facial injuries was so upsetting that John never even noticed the 3 bullet holes in Sherry's chest or the bite mark on the inside of her left forearm. By 8 p.m., so 1 hour and 45 minutes after first responders had arrived inside of Unit 205, the lead detective on the Sherry Rasmussen murder case had also arrived on the scene. While the crime scene techs were busy taking pictures and marking the location of pieces of evidence, Detective Lyle Mayer joined his junior partner and the head of the Van Nuys Homicide Bureau to do a walkthrough of the crime scene. As the husband of the victim, and as the person who first discovered Sherry's body, John was automatically a person of interest, and the detective planned to question John at the police station as soon as investigators finished this initial examination of each room in the townhouse. The investigator also knew that it would take days and even weeks before all the evidence collected from the scene would be fully cataloged, tested, and analyzed. But even without all that information yet to come, at the end of an hour, Detective Mayer and his two colleagues had formed what Mayer believed was a very strong theory about the cause of Sherry's death. Starting with the stack of stereo equipment next to the door and the apparent theft of Sherry's expensive BMW car from the garage, it looked to Detective Mayer like Sherry had been the victim of a burglary that had gone tragically wrong. And 2 hours later, after questioning Sherry's husband John at the Van Nuys police station, Detective Mayer had not discovered any information that seemed to contradict that theory. During his interview with the detective, John had been obviously upset over his wife's death, often breaking down in tears as he answered one question after another. But over the course of the interview, John was able to give the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, a complete account of John's last conversation with Sherry before John left for work that morning, and also a complete account of where and how John himself had spent the day. And when John described exactly what he had done before leaving the house for work that morning, the detective was also sure he just figured out why there was no sign of forced entry at the crime scene. According to John, while he had locked the door of the townhouse that led into the garage stairway, he had not checked the front door or armed the security system. It now seemed likely to the detective that all the attacker or burglar had to do to get inside the townhouse was just turn the front doorknob and walk right inside. And no, John told the detective, he and Sherry did not keep a gun in their house. No, John had never and would never hurt Sherry. No, they had no enemies. And finally, absolutely no, there were no problems or issues with their marriage. No disagreements about money, no ex-girlfriends or ex-boyfriends, no unexpected or unwanted visitors, and no unusual calls, just a technical glitch that had caused their phone to ring, even though when he or Sherry answered, the line was always dead. Crying, John told the detective that he and Sherry had just celebrated their 3rd-month anniversary of their marriage. Quote, "We just got married," John said. "We were having the best time." End quote. Meanwhile, as John's interview was wrapping up, back at Balboa Townhomes, the senior coroner was examining Sherry's body, and John's parents were finishing the 3.5-hour drive from their home in San Diego up to Van Nuys. And by the time the coroner had ordered Sherry's body transported from her home to the county morgue for an autopsy, John and his parents were checking in to the local Travelodge motel. At 1 a.m., almost 7 hours after John had discovered Sherry's dead body inside of their townhouse, John asked his father to call Sherry's family and tell them that Sherry had been murdered. At 1 p.m. in the afternoon of April 10th, 1986, so 6.5 weeks after Sherry Rasmussen's murder, Detective Mayer got the break in his investigation that he'd been hoping for, the one that he was sure confirmed his theory that Sherry had been killed in the course of a robbery gone wrong. It was also a break that Detective Mayer hoped would help him do what he'd so far failed to do, which was to make an arrest and close the books on this homicide. Not that the lead investigator hadn't made significant progress since receiving that 911 call from Unit 205 on the night of Monday, February 24th. Over the last 46 days, the police had gathered witness statements and done interviews that allowed the detective and his team to narrow the time of Sherry's murder to sometime between 7:30 and 10 in the morning. Police had also been able to identify the type of gun that was used to fire the 3 shots that had actually ended Sherry's life. as well as shattered the door to the balcony, scattering the broken pieces of glass that John had seen in the driveway on the evening that he had discovered Sherry's body. Police had also recovered Sherry's missing purse, apparently just thrown away not far from the murder scene, as well as her stolen silver BMW, which was found 11 days after the murder, undamaged with the keys in the ignition. In addition to providing police with his alibi, John Ruetten had agreed to take a lie detector test, and while he was too emotional for the results of that test to be conclusive, Detective Mayer felt comfortable crossing him off the suspect list. The most frustrating part of the last 6 weeks had been the detective's interaction with Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, who had arrived in Van Nuys the day after Sherry's murder, accompanied by his wife and Sherry's 2 sisters. Nels, a logger and woodsman turned successful dentist, was all about the questions he thought the detective had not asked, like why had John and Sherry installed that security system in the first place? What were they afraid of? And why weren't detectives questioning John Ruetten's ex-girlfriends? And why weren't police following up on Sherry's complaints to Nels that she was being followed by someone? And why couldn't John seem to recall any of these arguments he'd been having with his wife over money? And over Sherry's conviction that someone was openly watching them. The detective had been very happy when Nels and his family had left Los Angeles after just 3 days to head back to Tucson, Arizona, where they would bury their daughter at a family-only service on March 2nd, just 8 days after her death. But now, 1.5 months later, Detective Mayer wouldn't have minded having a quick conversation with Nels Rasmussen, because the police report that had just landed on the detective's desk looked like it answered every single one of Nels' loudly expressed doubts over Mayer's theory that burglars had killed his daughter. The report detailed a robbery that had happened earlier that day, just 2 blocks from the townhouse where Sherry had been murdered 1.5 months earlier. Except this time, the woman who had surprised the robbers while they were in the act of ransacking her home, she had not been killed or injured. Instead of confronting her, the robbers had fled, leaving a stack of her expensive stereo equipment next to an exit door and driving off in a blue station wagon they'd parked at the curb. Despite these differences in the 2 crimes, one ended in murder and the theft of a getaway vehicle, while the other did not, Detective Mayer could almost hear the click in his mind as all the pieces of his burglar theory in the Sherry Rasmussen murder investigation fell into place. And this time, he had an eyewitness, a victim who had been able to tell police what the intruders looked like. By late afternoon, police had linked that recent burglary to Sherry's murder, and they had released police sketches of 2 Hispanic men that were now considered likely suspects in both crimes. But over the next few months, despite police detaining and questioning a handful of men and known criminals who matched those descriptions, Detective Mayer and his team were never able to identify and charge the robbers who broke into the condo near Sherry's house, or pull in any other suspects who could be linked to the Sherry Rasmussen murder. Instead, by the end of May, 86 days after Sherry's murder, the investigation into her death went cold. Over the next 19 years, the case file of the Sherry Rasmussen murder would be reviewed 3 more times. And in 1991, when Detective Mayer retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, the case would be handed over to a new lead investigator. And during all those years, John Ruetten would move on with his life. He never went back to live in the townhouse he had shared with Sherry, and unlike Sherry's father, Nels, John rarely contacted police to offer any additional information, check in on the investigation, or to urge police to try new leads in solving Sherry's murder. In 1990, John took a trip to Hawaii where he ran into an old college friend, and the 2 of them enjoyed a short romantic holiday together before going their separate ways. And by 1993, John had met and married the woman who would become his second wife. It wasn't until February 2009, 23 years after Sherry's death, that Los Angeles homicide detectives would finally get the tip they needed to break the Sherry Rasmussen murder case wide open. On Monday, February 2nd, the day after the 2009 Super Bowl football game, Detective Jim Nuttall found a box of files on murder investigations called murder books waiting for him on his desk when he arrived at work. These were cases so old and so cold that his job was to review and organize them before sending them into deep storage. The first book he pulled out of the box was the file on Sherry's 1986 murder. But on what should have been a quick and final read-through of the case, the detective's attention was riveted by the results of a DNA test that had come back 4 years earlier in 2005. That DNA analysis, along with several other details of the crime scene, blew huge holes in the theory that Sherry's death had been a burglary gone wrong. And before long, Detective Nuttall, with the help of a new team of investigators, had a list of 5 new suspects in Sherry's murder. And just 3 months later, investigators had narrowed that list to just one name. On June 3, 2009, a special surveillance unit of the Los Angeles Police Force was trailing this one suspect into a popular big box retail store called Costco, located in Simi Valley, the same area where Sherry and her husband John had gone to the movies together on the night before Sherry was killed. Like so many other shoppers at Costco, their target had stopped at the store's outdoor food court for lunch. The team watched as their target drank from a straw stuck into a cup of soda. And when their target had finished eating and tossed that cup of soda into a trash can on the way out of the food court, it was only a matter of seconds before the team had whisked the cup and the straw, with its precious load of their suspect's saliva and DNA, into a manila envelope, returned to their vehicles out in the parking lot, and driven south to hand-deliver the package to the Los Angeles Police Department Special Investigations Division. 2 days later, on Friday, June 5th, police brought that suspect in for questioning. What they would discover over the course of a 4-hour interrogation, coupled with new DNA tests and a review of the old murder book on Sherry Rasmussen, would send shockwaves throughout the city of Los Angeles. Based on those findings, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the day that Sherry Rasmussen was murdered over 23 years earlier. Monday, February 24, 1986, was a beautiful winter day in Van Nuys, California. By 7:30 in the morning, the temperature was on its way up from cool to warm without being hot. The sky was clear and the air was still. But standing outside the Balboa Boulevard townhouses, Sherry's killer hardly noticed the nice weather. They were too busy watching for John Rutan's car to leave the gated complex so they could get busy with that morning's work. And sure enough, a few minutes before 7:30, there was the maroon Mazda easing out onto Balboa Boulevard and about to turn north for the 30-minute drive to John's office. To the killer, the daily routines of this newly married couple were as familiar as the killer's own routines. After all, the killer had been spending months watching them, especially after finding out about their engagement back in May of 1984. Even before that, though, the killer had begun to keep careful notes about where and when the killer had observed either John or Sherry, including the visits the killer had made to their townhouse, the restaurants where the killer had watched them together, and the gym where Sherry went to take aerobics classes. Sherry's killer even took pleasure in knowing that Sherry was aware that she was being watched, and that Sherry so obviously disliked the killer, especially after their confrontation at Sherry's place of work back in August of 1985, 3 months after the couple's engagement. But as of today, Sherry's killer was done watching. Patting their pocket, the killer felt the weight and shape of the .38 caliber revolver with the short barrel, along with the length of cord the killer could use to tie Sherry's hands or feet. As for getting into Unit 205, that should be easy. Even if the doors were locked, it would not be the first time that the killer had let themselves in using the keypad. And a few minutes later, before Sherry was supposed to leave for work, the killer, silent as a ghost, was standing inside the living room. After taking a moment to get their bearings, the killer crossed the tile and carpet to walk up the short flight of stairs to the next level where the dining room, kitchen, and small breakfast room were located. And that is where Sherry, walking down from her bedroom, dressed in her short red robe, underwear top, and black panties, found her attacker. And that is where Sherry began to fight for her life. The murderer's first 2 gunshots missed their target, and instead of hitting Sherry, they passed through a curtain and shattered the sliding glass door leading out to the patio. As soon as the killer had raised the weapon, Sherry had turned and made a run for the stairs leading down to the living room and to the panic button that was located in the alarm panel next to the front door. But Sherry's killer was strong and fast, and before Sherry could make it to the door, the killer was on her. Everything about the crime scene, along with the medical examiner's autopsy report, would testify to just how close Sherry would come to disarming and possibly defeating her attacker. In the struggle that followed, the entertainment wall unit collapsed, the phone fell to the floor, wires were ripped out of sockets, lamps fell over, and crime scene techs would find 2 of Sherry's torn fingernails on the floor near the security panel, along with a single bloody handprint where Sherry had come so close to hitting the alarm. At some point, police believe that Sherry actually managed to get control of the murderer's gun and put her attacker into a headlock. It was at that point that the killer bit the inside of Sherry's left forearm to break free, and then grabbed hold of a nearby ceramic vase that the killer brought down with all their force onto Sherry's forehead. Stunned, Sherry crumpled to the floor. Regaining control of the gun, the killer leaned down and pressed the weapon directly into Sherry's chest and fired the first of 3 shots. Then, the killer paused long enough to grab a quilt from off a nearby chair, wrap the thick blanket around the muzzle of the gun to deaden the sound, aim the weapon again at Sherry's chest, and fire 2 more shots. At some point in the struggle, ligature marks on Sherry's arms just above the wrists indicated that she had been tied with a cord that was left at the scene of the crime. Her hands, head, and neck would be covered with defensive wounds, bruises, cuts, and scratches, but the most severe damage to Sherry's face, the damage that would be so upsetting to John Ruetten that he would cover his wife's face with a hand towel after calling 911, had been caused by blunt trauma, not just from being struck with the vase, but by being struck at least twice in the face with the butt of a gun. When the killer was sure that Sherry was dead, they stood for a moment over her body, letting their breathing return to normal. Then the killer looked around the room, taking in the damage, remembering the 3 roses in a vase on the dining room table on the next level, and planning how to arrange everything in the townhouse so it would appear to police that Sherry had been killed in a robbery gone wrong. It didn't take much work. All the killer had to do was knock over a few more small items of furniture, pull the drawer out of an end table, and put the stereo equipment in a stack by the door. Then the killer rifled through Sherry's belongings until they found her purse with her wallet and her marriage license inside, as well as the keys to her silver BMW. As the killer left the living room to walk down the stairs into the garage, they left small flecks of Sherry's blood on the wall. What the killer did not realize was that they had also left one of their own bloody fingerprints on the stack of stereo equipment next to the townhouse door, as well as a sample of their saliva embedded in the bite wound on Sherry's left arm. A few minutes later, and the killer had slid behind the driver's wheel of Sherry's engagement car, turned on the engine, and backed out the driveway. The killer left the garage door open as they drove out of the Balboa townhouse complex. 3 years later, the killer would finally meet up again with Sherry's widower, John Ruetten, on a vacation in Hawaii. But a relationship that the killer had hoped would end in love and marriage would only last for a few days. And then John would go back to his new home in San Diego and meet a new woman who would eventually become his second wife. Just as John had left the killer once before, years ago, for the beautiful and radiant Sherry Rasmussen. After kissing John goodbye in Hawaii, Sherry's killer, best known to John as the on-again, off-again sexual partner he had met back in college, packed her bags and headed home to Los Angeles. And once there, Sherry's killer, up-and-coming Los Angeles Police Department detective Stephanie Lazarus, did her best to put both John, a man she had loved obsessively since 1978, and Sherry, the romantic rival she had gunned down on February 23, 1986, out of her mind. It would turn out that all of Sherry Rasmussen's fears about being followed were true. But as far as Sherry was concerned, from the very beginning, there had been very little doubt about who that stalker was and why this woman was harassing Sherry. Because back in June of 1985, just weeks after Sherry and John had announced their engagement, Sherry had gotten a visit from an off-duty police officer named Stephanie Lazarus, who told Sherry point blank, quote, "If I can't have John, you can't either," end quote. Stephanie, who had shown up in Sherry's office at work, dressed in very tight short shorts and a tank top that showed off her very fit body, then went on to tell Sherry that Stephanie and John, who had met 15 years earlier at the University of California in Los Angeles, were still having sex with one another, and that if Sherry's marriage failed, Stephanie would be right there to pick up the pieces. And when Sherry confronted John about this visit from Stephanie and what Stephanie had told her, John confessed that it was true. That after finding out about his engagement to Sherry, Stephanie had called John in tears and asked him to come visit and comfort her. John had agreed, and he also agreed to have what he described to Sherry as, quote, closure sex with Stephanie. John also insisted that Stephanie might think she was his girlfriend, but as far as John was concerned, they were just more like sex buddies. John promised Sherry he would end things with Stephanie, but instead of contacting Stephanie directly and making it clear to her that he was not ever interested in a romantic relationship, John just cut off all communication on his end without telling Stephanie why. Meanwhile, Stephanie, somehow bypassing the townhouse security system, started to show up at John and Sherry's unit, dropping off skis for John to wax or popping in to say hi to John. When Sherry objected to this, John refused to take any action. Instead, he told his wife to, quote, just let this die, end quote. By the time Sherry and John were celebrating their 3-month wedding anniversary on Sunday, February 23rd, Sherry's father, Nels, had the impression that Sherry was so frustrated and unhappy that she had decided to take steps of her own to resolve the situation with John's ex-girlfriend, a woman who she had only described to Nels as a cop with the Los Angeles Police Department. Sherry could have no way of knowing that Stephanie had also decided to resolve the situation, and on the morning of the following day, Monday, February 24th, Stephanie Lazarus would accomplish that by murdering her ex-boyfriend's wife and making the crime look like a robbery gone wrong. But if Sherry expected that she would become the next Mrs. Rutan, she was wrong. John would meet up with Stephanie for a fling in Hawaii, but other than that, their relationship ended with Sherry's death. Still, it wasn't until 2005, 19 years after the murder, that Stephanie's perfect cover-up of that murder started to unravel. That's when investigators who were reviewing the case happened to stumble across a piece of evidence that had apparently been misplaced, the swab taken from the bite wound on Sherry's arm. Using DNA tests that had not been available in 1986, investigators discovered that the DNA on that swab showed that Sherry's killer was a female. But when the DNA profile did not match any known offenders in the National DNA Database, police once again closed the investigation. It wouldn't be until February 2009, 4 years later, that Detective Jim Nuttall would review the Sherry Rasmussen murder book and understand the real significance of that DNA finding. If Sherry's killer was a single female, then the original theory about the murderer being 2 male suspects was wrong. There was also a picture of a bloody fingerprint on the stack of stereo equipment found by the door of Sherry's living room, suggesting that the equipment had been stacked after and not before the murder had happened. And just like that, Nels Rasmussen's unshakable conviction that his daughter's killer was one of John's ex-girlfriends suddenly looked very likely. And going back almost 23 years, Nels had already put a name to that girlfriend, LAPD Detective Stephanie Lazarus. And by June of 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was number 1 on Detective Nuttall's suspect list too. As he took a closer look at one of LAPD's star detectives, now assigned to art theft detail, the circumstantial evidence kept mounting up. On the day of Sherry's murder, Stephanie had taken the day off, and the weapon used to kill Sherry matched the description of a gun that Stephanie would report stolen 10 days after the murder. There were also the irregularities that the detective had discovered in the case file itself, like someone with police-level access to the murder book had removed any reports or paperwork that contained Stephanie's name, including the handwritten notes and chronology that detailed the entire first 3 months of the Rasmussen investigation. On June 3rd, a surveillance unit that had been following Officer Lazarus collected a DNA sample from a cup Stephanie had thrown away while eating lunch at Costco. And 2 days later, the DNA analysis of that saliva would prove to be a match to the DNA of the killer who had bitten Sherry's inner arm. Stephanie's DNA would also match tissue collected from under Sherry's broken fingernails. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested at the Los Angeles Police Headquarters and charged with the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. When police searched Stephanie's house shortly after the arrest, they would find a 600-page-long journal that included passages detailing Stephanie's relationship with John and how closely she had watched John and Sherry. Police would also find a well-worn picture taken back in 1979 of John sleeping in his dorm room at college. On the back, in Stephanie's handwriting, was this inscription, quote, "I snuck in at 1 a.m. and took this photo," end quote. In 2012, 3 years after her arrest, Stephanie Lazarus would be found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Sherry Rasmussen, and she would be sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. On Tuesday, September 11, 2001, 30-year-old Michael Wright hopped into a crowded elevator and pressed the number 81. Michael was an account executive for a telecommunications company that operated out of New York's famous World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan. It was made up of 7 different buildings. Michael's building was one of the 2 identical, massive 110-story tall skyscrapers that were collectively called the Twin Towers, and then separately they were called the North Tower and the South Tower. Michael's company was in the North Tower. Once the elevator reached floor 81, the doors opened up and Michael squeezed his way out of the car, and right ahead of him, on the wall right in front of him, he would have seen 3 other elevator doors, and then on the wall behind him, there would have been another 3 elevator doors, one of which he just exited. To his right, there was just a wall, and then to his left was a set of glass doors that fed out into this big hallway that wrapped all the way around the building. Now, this hallway, there were offices on either side as you went around the 81st floor, but while you were in this hallway, you couldn't actually look out the windows and see this incredible view of New York. The views were only accessible once you were inside of these various office buildings. And so Michael, he gets out of the elevator, he turns left, he goes through those doors, and then he turns right, and he starts walking down this hallway, and then he stops in front of this wooden door on his left. And this was the door to his company, which was called Networks Plus. So he opens that up, and right in front of him is this huge open office space with all these cubicles. And even though it was quite early, dozens of his coworkers were already there with their headsets on and they're chatting and clicking away on their computers. But Michael was not in a rush. He had a morning routine and he was not about to break it now. And so he just strolled into the room, he said hi to a couple people, and he walked as if he was going towards the very back of the office, towards the windows. But just before he reached the windows, he found his cubicle on the right, and so he dropped his bag next to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he just kept on walking, he turned right, and he went down this corridor, and then he turned right, and he was facing this cafeteria. And the cafeteria for the company, it was really just this small room with a couple of tables and chairs. There was a fridge, there was a coffee machine. It was really just kind of a lounge area. So he went in there and he grabbed a paper cup, he filled it with coffee, and then he grabbed a bran muffin that was on a community tray. And then he left the cafeteria and went back to his desk and he sat down. And when he sat down, it was 7:45 a.m. And so he didn't immediately turn on his computer and throw his headset on and just dive into work. Instead, he just kind of enjoyed his coffee, enjoyed his bran muffin, and thought about what he was going to do that day. Typically on Tuesdays, Michael would go out and see clients and he would make some sales calls. And so Michael was just kind of sitting there getting his head right for the day. And then after he finished his breakfast, he threw on his headset, he powered up his computer, he checked his email, he started calling around to different clients to set up meetings for later that day. And then around 8:40 a.m., Michael realized he had to go to the bathroom. And so Michael took off his headset, he stood up, he turned around, he left his cubicle, and then instead of walking deeper into the office towards the windows in the cafeteria, he turned left and started walking back towards the main door that fed into his office. So he gets to this door, he opens it up, he steps out into the main hallway, and then he turns left and starts walking away from where the elevators are. Those are down to his right. And so he walks maybe 10 or 15 feet down this main hallway before he reaches a door to the men's room, which is on his right. And so he notices on the door, there's this sign that he hadn't seen before that said, "Please keep the bathroom clean." So he reads the sign, doesn't think much of it, pushes the door open, and when he gets in there, there's a couple of his male colleagues that are kind of yucking it up in the corner. And they're actually laughing about the sign that was on the bathroom door. Bank of America had just recently moved into the 81st floor. So now Michael and his company were sharing this floor with Bank of America, and Bank of America had put that sign on the bathroom door. And so the guys were saying, oh, so you come into our space and the first day you're here, you're telling us we're dirty? And so Michael, he kind of laughed along with them because once you put it in context, it did seem kind of passive aggressive. At 8:46 a.m., Michael turned away from this group of laughing guys and began walking over to the urinals on the wall. But before he even got to the urinals, suddenly the building jolted hard to one side. Now, the Twin Towers were built to withstand very heavy winds, and so the way they were constructed to do that was they would flex several inches in any direction at any time. But this was not several inches, this was several feet. And it was so violent and so sudden that the marble on the walls actually cracked and fell off. And the guys in the bathroom, most of them lost their balance and fell to the ground. And the one guy who was inside of a stall, he comes running out, he bursts the door open, he's buttoning his pants up, and he's screaming, "What was that?" Michael, after standing back up, began thinking to himself, did I hear a sound? Was there an explosion? What was that? It must have been a gas main explosion. What else could that have possibly been? There was just nothing else he could think of that would account for that big of a shift. But there was just no time to sit there and dwell on how this happened because the alarms in the building started going off. And so Michael and the other guys that were in there, they just left the bathroom to go out to the hallway to see what was going on. And when Michael got out there, he looked left down the main hallway past his office, all the way down to the elevators. And all the way down there, he could see there was clearly fire spitting out of the elevator lobby area. And so before Michael could even process that there was this fire and what he was going to do about it, he heard screaming, a woman screaming behind him. The women's bathroom was right next to the men's bathroom. And so Michael and a couple of the other guys who had been in the bathroom with him, they go running into the women's room, and there was this stall, this bathroom stall in the women's room that had been kind of bent over. And it would turn out during the shift in the building, the door jamb on one of the stalls had folded over, kind of locking it in place, and there was a woman on the other side of the stall. There was a woman in the stall. And so that was the woman who was screaming, and so the men, they get in there, they start kicking and punching this door, trying to get it open, and finally they do, and they're able to pull this woman out. They go back out into the hallway, and right away, Michael notices there is a cloud of white smoke that is filling the entire hallway. It's towards the top, so they can kind of duck down to avoid the smoke. And so Michael's hunched down, and he looks left down the hallway towards where he knows this fire is, and he sees the fire has gotten much larger, and the flames have jumped into the hallway. It's still pretty far away, but clearly this fire is spreading. And so Michael, he's crouched down and he's watching as people are streaming out of his office down the hall, and everyone's kind of avoiding this fire. They're running up to where Michael and the others have congregated. Michael, who's crouched down, he's still kind of just looking generally towards the fire, almost stunned, when he notices something about the ground. There was this huge crack in the ground that ran from where he was all the way down the hall, all the way to the fire. And then Michael turned around and saw that crack actually continued all the way in the other direction. It looked like the floor had literally broken in half, and it was like the floor was going to fall off the building. And so as Michael is crouched down, just staring at this crack, not really sure what to think about it, he started to listen to what people were saying in the hall. Everyone's beginning to speculate about what caused this fire, what caused the building to shift like that. And a lot of people tended to believe it was a gas main explosion, which is what Michael thought. Other people suggested, maybe it was an earthquake, and some outliers said it could have been a bomb. But little did anybody know what had happened to their building was far worse than anything they could have imagined. A few minutes earlier at 8:46 a.m., as Michael stood in the bathroom kind of yucking it up with the other guys that were in there, American Airlines Flight 11, which was this massive 767 passenger airplane carrying 91 passengers, 5 of which were the hijackers, they slammed into Michael's tower 12 floors above Michael's head. The plane was traveling at about 466 miles per hour when it struck the building. The impact and subsequent explosion immediately killed not only everyone on board the plane, but hundreds of people that were inside of the impact zone, which was between floors 93 and 99. The plane also went right through the building, severing all of the stairwells and the elevator shafts, meaning anyone who was still alive from floors 93 all the way to the top, floor 110, all those people, they didn't have an escape route anymore. So they were trapped, they just didn't know it yet. And to make an already horrible situation even worse, after this plane detonates inside of the North Tower, it sends 9,000 gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts. And as this fuel tumbled, it would splash onto many of the floors below, like floor 81. The fuel would kind of splash through the openings to the elevator doors. And once a little bit had landed on that floor, the whole floor would catch on fire. But Michael and the rest of the people on floor 81 were completely oblivious to this. All they knew was there's a fire over there, and so we need to get away from it. But as Michael stood up from this crack and began kind of looking around to see what they were going to do next, he noticed that most of the people, while they were staying calm, were not really running to evacuate. They were just kind of standing around, and the different business managers from different departments were just kind of telling their staff members to stay calm and hold on, let's get our thoughts together. And Michael, who was not panicked, at least not yet, he's looking around thinking, you know what, let's just get off this floor. We need to get off this floor. And so he remembered that a lot of his friends, they would sneak out of the office and they would smoke cigarettes in this one particular emergency stairwell that was close to them. And so Michael just started yelling to the group, hey, we got to go now, we need to leave. There's stairs over there, follow me. And so Michael kind of cut through the crowd, and the crowd was very quick to respond. They kind of followed him, and he opened the door, he goes into the stairwell, and he lets some people go in. And before long, there's a very orderly double file line making their way down this stairwell. Michael remembers after he joined this double file line and began going down the steps, this immediate sense of relief, especially after they got down a couple of flights away from the 81st floor. Because in his mind, and in a lot of other people's minds that were in the stairwell with him, the problem was up there. It was the 81st floor. There was this one fire. It was localized. It would be dealt with. And they're already all the way down here. They'll be out of the building soon, so they got nothing to worry about. And so Michael and the rest of his coworkers just kept making their way down the stairs. It was very slow progress. And sometimes it would come to a complete standstill because other people on lower floors were entering the stairwell and joining in this evacuation. But Michael remembers nobody was freaking out. No one was panicking. There were some people that, were more worked up about it, but there really was this sense of safety, that they were in these stairs and that everything was going fine. And so as they're kind of making their way down, most people were concerned with trying to place a call to their family to just tell them, hey, I'm okay. This crazy thing happened at work today, but, I'm going to be fine. Michael had left his cell phone on his desk, so he didn't have a way to call his family. He got a coworker to give him his phone, and Michael tried dozens of times to reach his wife, Jenny, but when he called her, she didn't pick up, and so eventually he just gave the phone back to his coworker and just continued down the steps. At about 9 a.m., so that would have been about 10 or 12 minutes into this evacuation down the stairs, Michael, who again is in relatively good spirits, he knows there's danger upstairs, but they're safe down here, he makes this kind of off-color joke to lighten the mood in the stairwell. Michael turns to one of his male colleagues and pretends to confess his love to him and tells him, the only reason I'm confessing it to you now is because we're gonna die here anyways. Now, the joke here in Michael's mind was, of course we're not gonna die here. He was intentionally dramatizing the entire situation because they were safe. They were in the stairwell, they were evacuating, the fire was up there, they're down here, everything is fine. And some people thought the joke was kind of funny and they laughed at it. But the guy right ahead of Michael didn't think it was funny, and he turned around and looked at Michael and said, hey man, you gotta keep your humor down in here. So Michael, he did immediately regret telling his joke, but not because he was suddenly scared that this situation was far more dangerous than he was realizing, but because he just felt bad for offending some people. Michael would later reflect on this moment, and he would say he was so naive that even though he had seen the fire and seen the physical damage, that crack on the ground and the marble falling off the wall, that despite all that, it was like he just couldn't fathom that they were actually in any real danger inside of this stairwell. He really thought they were going to be just fine. But of course, as history would show us, Michael was wrong. Around the time that Michael was scolded for his off-color joke, about 200 feet to the south of the tower they were in, another passenger airplane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the south side of the South Tower. All 65 passengers on board, which included the 5 hijackers, were killed instantly. The plane was traveling at about 590 miles an hour when it struck the South Tower, and it hit between floors 77 and 85, killing hundreds of people in the impact site and trapping hundreds more above it. And then just like the North Tower, after this plane detonated inside of the South Tower, It sent thousands of gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts, igniting fires on many floors below. Despite being so physically close to this second plane crash, Michael didn't hear it, and apparently no one else in the stairwell did either, or they just didn't recognize it for what it was. And so Michael and the others just continued walking down the stairwell thinking everything was fine. Around 9:30 a.m., so that's about 40 minutes into their evacuation, Michael and the rest of his coworkers reached floor 40, and this was the first time they saw firefighters, New York firefighters, running up the stairs to go fight this fire. And so naturally, Michael and the others asked the firemen if they knew what had caused this fire, what was going on, but the firefighters just said, look, we don't know exactly what caused this, but go down, it's safe down there. Michael would remember about seeing these firefighters that they all had a similar look on their face. They had this kind of stoic, just kind of neutral look on their face, very calm, very mission-oriented as they charged up the stairs in all this heavy gear. But years later, as Michael reflected on that situation, he thinks about their faces, and now he believes the look they had on their face was actually fear. And unfortunately, most of the firefighters that ran past Michael and the others and went up to fight that fire in the North Tower, they would all perish. A few minutes later, Michael and the others made it down to floor 30, and right around the time they got there, they heard people behind them, above them from higher floors, yelling for people to get out of the way. And so Michael turned around and looked up, and he saw there were some people carrying other people down the stairs, and they were trying to clear a path to get these injured people down. And so Michael, like everybody else, kind of sucked up against the side of the wall to let these people pass. And when they did, he saw there were two injured people. There was one guy who his whole shirt had been burned off of his back, exposing his bare back, and he had burns on the top of his shoulder. And then the other injured person was this woman with severe burns on her face. After they passed, Michael and the people around him kind of got back in line and just kept moving down the stairs, but now they were on edge. Everyone was kind of thinking to themselves, how bad is this fire? Who else got hurt? What actually happened up there? A few minutes later, Michael and his coworkers got down to floor 20, and that's when they saw there was this firefighter yelling to everyone, asking, hey, does anybody know CPR? I need volunteers who know CPR. And so Michael, he had been trained in CPR 10 years earlier in college, and while he hadn't done it in a while, he felt confident that push came to shove, he could do it. And so he and another guy that was near him volunteered to be these CPR guys. And so they went over to this firefighter who explained to them, stay right here and be ready to do CPR on anyone that is brought down to you. And if anybody else needs help, I need you to try to help them too. So just basically be here as a resource. And so Michael and the other volunteers say, no problem, and they stay right there. And the firefighter grabs all of his heavy equipment and he charges up the stairs. Over the next 10 minutes, Michael and this other guy did not need to perform CPR. However, they did assist one very heavy man that was having a very hard time breathing. They helped walk him down all the way to the bottom. And then Michael and the other volunteer, they turned around and ran back up to the 20th floor. And as they're running up, they're asking everyone around them, hey, do you need help? Do you need help? But nobody needed any help. And so when they got back up to the 20th floor, they were there for a couple more minutes. And then by about 9:50 a.m., there were no more people coming down the stairs. It was just Michael and this other volunteer. And so that's when they decided that it's time to go. And so they bounded down the stairs and they got all the way to the ground floor at about 9:55 a.m. And Michael, he opened the door that led out to the ground floor, which was the plaza level. And what he saw was the worst thing he had ever seen in his life. The people that were located in the North and South Tower above the impact sites would have eventually realized they did not have an escape route. Stairwells were blocked, the elevators didn't work, and so naturally the only way to go was up. And so I'm sure initially there was some speculation amongst these people that a helicopter could come up and get them, or some other way they were going to be rescued. We just need to get higher and higher and higher. But eventually they got to the roof and they got to the upper levels and there was no rescue. And the fire that was raging below them from the jet fuel, it was growing and creeping higher and higher, and all this black smoke was leaking into the vents of these upper floors. And so the heat and the smoke and the flames, it was driving these people to the absolute top of this building. And eventually these people who were trapped, they would have realized there isn't a rescue that's going to get us in time. We're doomed. And so these poor people in their final moments, they picked up their phones and they called their loved ones one more time. And so there are all these totally heartbreaking messages of these trapped people calling their family to say how much they love them and how much they're going to miss them. And there are an equal number of messages of these people calling their family to say how scared they are, that they're not ready to die. Eventually, the fire, the heat, the smoke would become so intense that these trapped people would actually go outside the building and would hang on to the windows, dangling hundreds and hundreds of feet off the ground because there was nowhere else to go. And then eventually, when all hope was lost, these mothers and fathers, these wives, these husbands, these sisters, these brothers, these daughters, these sons, these friends, they began jumping off of the tower to their death. Almost all of them jumped alone, but at least one eyewitness saw a couple holding hands. One woman who was falling, in a final act of modesty, held her skirt down. Other people tried to make parachutes out of tablecloths and curtains, but as soon as they jumped, these things were ripped from their hands. The fall from the upper floors of both towers took about 10 seconds, and when their bodies hit the ground, they weren't just broken, they were obliterated. And so Michael, when he opens this door, he steps out into this lobby that's at the plaza level, and he turns and he looks at this huge set of windows that look out into this 200-foot-long stretch of open pavement that separates the north tower that he is in with the south tower. And scattered all across this stretch of pavement are about 50 different bodies. The majority of these people had jumped. The rest were either people that had fallen out of the tower from the impact of the plane, or they were passengers on board one of the two planes that actually hit the towers. Michael had no way of processing what he was looking at, because as far as he understood, there was just this fire at the top of the tower he was in. How could all these people be out here? What happened to them? And so as he's scanning the absolute horrors outside, he also sees there is blood all over the windows. And that was from the people that had fallen close to the building. And so as he's seeing all this blood and this carnage, he just puts his hand up over his eyes. Like he doesn't want to look at what's going on outside. He just can't possibly process it. And so instead, he and this other guy, they say, okay, let's not go outside, because if we go outside, something could land on us, a person could land on us. We don't know what's going on out there. Let's go down one more level, because there was another set of stairs right ahead of them in the lobby that went down to the shopping mall, and the shopping mall extended outside away from the tower, and there was street access maybe a half a block away. And so Michael and this other guy he was with, they run over to the stairs, they go down into the shopping mall, and down there it's dark and the sprinklers are going off, and they just start running through this mall trying to get to these stairs that'll bring them back up to the street level. And as they're going, they run into another group of people that are doing the same thing. And one of the people that was with this group was the same woman who had been trapped up in the bathroom on Michael's floor. And so Michael put his arm around her and was just kind of being comforting, and they start walking together. And Michael realized she was very shaken up by the bodies she had seen outside. And even though Michael was very shaken up by it too, he comforted her and said, we got to keep going, we got to keep going. And so the two of them just kept on going until they see up ahead, there's an emergency worker with a glow stick kind of waving people to go towards the stairs, get up onto the street, get out of here, evacuate as quickly as possible. And so Michael and this woman, they run right past the emergency worker. They're not even asking any questions at this point. They just want to get away from whatever it is that's going on. And so they get to the base of the stairs when Michael hears this really loud cracking sound coming from somewhere outside. And so Michael and this woman, they run up the stairs, they get out to the street, and outside it's totally chaos. There's people running around everywhere. There are papers all over the ground and other office furnishings. There are things on fire, and Michael just instinctively looks to his right. He looks down the road because that's generally where he thought he heard that really loud cracking sound coming from. And so he found himself looking at the Millennium Hotel, which is this beautiful hotel on the other side of the road from where he was standing a little ways down to the right. And the windows of the front of the Millennium Hotel are like mirrors. They're very reflective. And he found himself just looking at the reflection on the Millennium Hotel, and he noticed it was reflecting the South Tower. And the South Tower was basically across the street from the Millennium Hotel, basically a half block to the right of where Michael and this woman were. And as he's staring at this reflection of the South Tower, he suddenly realizes what that loud cracking sound was. It was the sound of the South Tower, which was still full of hundreds and hundreds of people collapsing. And so Michael is watching this South Tower collapse through this reflection on the front of the Millennium Hotel. He snaps out of it and turns, and he and the woman just run back down into the mall as fast as they can. They can hear this unbelievably loud sound of thousands and thousands of tons of just metal crashing down almost directly on top of them. And Michael makes it to the bottom of the stairs in the mall and just leaps onto his stomach and covers his head. And he's yelling his wife and his son's name because that's all he can think about. And then suddenly everything goes black. And at the same time, suddenly his mouth, his ears, his nose, everything is just packed with what felt like sand, when in reality it was this white dust that was made from the collapse of the South Tower. And it was made up of pulverized concrete and asbestos and other very toxic chemicals. So as all these building materials are falling down into the mall, also there was this rush of this white dust. And so Michael is just laying there, he can barely breathe, and he's hearing all these big pieces of metal come smashing down all around him, and he's getting ready mentally to just die at any moment. But after a few agonizing seconds, the sounds of the falling materials from the South Tower began to cease after the collapse was basically done, and suddenly Michael began to hear the sound of other people crying and moaning. And so Michael suddenly was acutely aware that he had survived the collapse of the South Tower, but now was almost certainly going to die a slow and horrible death trapped underneath all of this debris. And so in total darkness, Michael just began trying to pull his arms and legs out from whatever it was that was on top of him. And amazingly, he got all of his limbs out. And right away, he began trying to pull this soot and this dust out of his nose and his mouth and his ears. And as soon as his mouth was clear, he began vomiting, and then he was trying to catch his breath. But every breath he took in, there was all this smoke in the air, so it was very hard to breathe. And so Michael managed to rip off his shirt, which was already soaked from the sprinklers when they first came in, and he wrapped it around his head so it was a little bit easier to breathe. And so breathing through his shirt, Michael finally composes himself. And then Michael, he's thinking to himself, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now, but I know I need to move. And so he just started crawling. He has no idea where he's going. It is truly pitch black, but he's just kind of low crawling up and down and over things. He doesn't know where he's going. And then there's this miracle. He sees a little ways away from him, a light comes on. He didn't know what this light was, but he's in survival mode. And at this point, light represents hope. And so he just started crawling towards this light, and he managed to go up and over all this debris, and finally he gets to this clearing where this light is, and it turns out the light was a flashlight held by a fireman who had also survived the collapse of the South Tower. And so Michael crawls over right near this guy and realizes he can stand up. There's enough clearance. He stands up and he looks at this fireman who's this big guy with a mustache, and Michael says to him, "What are we going to do now?" And so this fireman apparently was remarkably composed, and he doesn't really say much to Michael. Instead, he just pulls his axe off his shoulder and kind of gestures for Michael to follow him. And so Michael naturally follows this fireman, and so he leads them over to this wall, and the fireman reaches out and he rubs the wall with his glove, and he rubs away a lot of soot and dirt to reveal a glass window. And so he tells Michael to stand back, and the fireman winds up and he smashes this window. And on the other side of this window is this Borders bookstore. And in the middle of this Borders bookstore is a staircase that goes up to the main floor and out onto the street. And so Michael thanked this fireman and then climbed through this opening into this bookstore. And as he was climbing through, he looked back towards the rubble and he saw there were lots of other people that were crawling out of the rubble and were getting in line to also climb into the bookstore. And so Michael, once he was through, he waited for a few people, and then they together ran to the staircase. They went up to the first floor and they went out to the street. And when they got out there, it was like the apocalypse. There was that white dust over everything, over people, cars, buildings, everything. They could barely see in front of them. And so Michael just reflexively began running away from the towers. And as he's running, he sees there's this woman just standing in the road and she's weeping. And Michael goes up to her and he says, "Are you okay? Can I help you?" And she is totally non-responsive. And so eventually Michael just leaves her and keeps on running. And after a couple of seconds, he sees there's this overturned food cart on the side of the road. So there's no one nearby. He runs over, he gets 2 iced teas out of the cooler. He opens one and pours it over his face to kind of clear his face off. And then he pours some into his mouth to wash his mouth out. And then he just keeps on running. And again, everything around him is just covered in this dust. And so as he's running, he eventually sees there's this cameraman that's got his camera trained in the direction of the towers. But the cameraman is not using his camera. Instead, he's hunched over his camera and he's just weeping, like he can't even report the news. And so Michael just kept on running and running, and at some point he heard another very loud cracking sound behind him, but he didn't even turn around. He just kept on running. And it would turn out it was the sound of his tower, the North Tower, collapsing as well. And just like the South Tower, there were hundreds of people inside it when it fell. And so Michael would eventually just continue running until he reached New York University, NYU. That was where his brother was working, and he hoped he would be there so he could tell him that he survived, that he was okay. But when he got to NYU, his brother wasn't there. However, there were staff people there that saw how horrible Michael looked. He was covered head to toe in the dust. He looked crazed. He had blood all over him. And so they took him in, they cleaned him up, and they gave him a phone. And he was able to get in touch with his wife, and he told her that he was okay. And his wife and his entire family, they were convinced he was dead. They had been watching on TV. They had seen the tower collapse. They knew he was up on the 81st floor. And so they really believed he was dead. But unbelievably, he survived. Michael would ultimately make a full physical recovery, although he would have to have several surgeries to remove the 147 pieces of fiberglass that had embedded in his eyes. Because when the tower collapsed and all that dust and soot got pushed into his mouth and his ears and his nose and his eyes, there were little pieces of fiberglass that basically turned into splinters on his eyes. Like most other 9/11 survivors, Michael thinks to himself, why me? Why did I survive when so many other people didn't? But Michael tries not to dwell on that. Instead, he focuses on trying to honor the memories of the people they lost, and he focuses on trying to be the best father to his sons he can possibly be. So that's going to do it, guys. Before you leave, please go into the description and check out the links to the charities I provided. These are extremely highly rated charities that are still providing support to 9/11 victims, their families, and first responders. The ripple effects of this attack are still felt today by lots of people. And so these charities I've identified are a way to support people that really need it. And so I have already donated to all of the charities listed. So I'm telling you, these are incredible organizations